You are now entering a dangerous liberty zone where God-given natural rights are held sacred and exercised. This is your warning. Tyranny, fascism, and censorship will not be tolerated. Ideas will be exchanged freely. Rigorous debate and open discourse is encouraged. If you are weak and your beliefs are fragile, you should leave now. Prepare yourself. We are now live on the Dangerous Liberty Podcast. All right, folks, welcome to another episode of the Dangerous Liberty Podcast, where we know that safety at the expense of liberty is slavery. Folks, I'm excited. I got to be honest with you. This is one of the coolest podcasts we've ever done. I can't wait to introduce you to our guest. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and welcome to the stage Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. Dr. Johnston, thank you so much for coming on. This is just a huge thing for me. Thank you very much.
Gary and Summer, it's a delight to be with you. I come to you from the People's Republic of Texas, the nation of Texas. It's great to be on your channel. I appreciate all the liberty-loving Americans and freedom-loving people around the world who are joining us, and I'm eager to get to the questions and comments, too.
That's awesome. No, I grew up in Beaumont. I don't know where you are exactly in Texas.
We're in Dallas, where God has a second home.
Oh, nice. I've heard
in
that.
The nation of Texas.
In the nation of Texas, without a doubt. Yeah, so if you will, Dr. Johnston, just kind of, I guess, first thing, just kind of introduce yourself, and then I guess we'll move on to like the Shroud, how you got involved with it, and then let the viewers out there that are watching now and in the future just know what the Shroud is in general, and I guess we'll take it from there.
Well, I love firearms. I've been a firearm owner for years and had to actually sell my arsenal before I moved to England to do my terminal education, and then Canada. So I've been in those places that think guns should be illegal, and they're not great societies. I've since been building my arsenal since then. We were talking offline about some of my new gun purchases. I have 4 sons, a daughter, and my son just had his first firearm training, 2 to the body, 1 to the head, and had a great training as a 12-year 20 years. And I just love being a follower of Jesus. That's what I care about. And I want to have a thinking faith. That means I don't want to have a faith that's necessarily inherited. I want to have a faith of my own. And so for me, that's taken me on this unique journey my whole life, that if the things that Jesus claimed really happened, there should be fallout all over the evidential world. And the amazing thing is that there's fallout everywhere about not only Jesus, but the movement that he began called Christianity and how it utterly transformed the world. So I'm an expert in historical Jesus studies, but I love to use normal, everyday language. Something I learned in Oxford was you don't use words that make you sound smart. The real key of being an intelligent person is the ability to translate meaning. And so, you know, I have 4 sons that go screensaver on me if I don't get it out quick. So I hope no one will go screensaver on me. We have a lot to discuss. I use short sentences, and I'm just excited to help people go on a journey of having a thinking faith. I have a website called Christian Thinkers. That's with an S, christianthinkers.com. Love for people to join my email list and be part of what we do. I travel around the country speaking at conferences and events all over the world, and just have a love to help you, those of you who are watching, own your faith better, and which means you answer the tough questions that you face as well. None of us should be paralyzed by a difficult question. So that's what I'm called to do.
That's awesome. And folks, there's definitely a bunch of links down in the description. Most of his socials on there. And on top of that, Dr. Johnston's book, his brand new book, there's a link down in the description for that as well. Go purchase you one. I already have some coming. And yeah, so anyways, with that being said, I guess just kind of take the floor and take us on the journey, Dr. Johnston.
Absolutely. So what are the implications if we have the moment of Jesus's resurrection in the material culture from archaeology? And what I mean by that is we have in our possession something that's known as the Shroud of Turin. And a shroud is just simply a linen burial garment that would fit around a body like a pita does, okay? It's like a pita, and it fits around the body, and it was used widely in Jewish burial traditions in the time of Jesus. And so when is that? That's the 1st century Roman Empire. Tiberius is the emperor. Pilate is the governor, the prefect of Israel. And we have this Jewish teacher by the name of Jesus of Nazareth who comes on the scene, and no one has ever seen the miracles that he does. No one has ever heard the kind of claims and aims that he espouses to. And and his movement begins to change the world. There's 10 or 15 other guys in the first century who claim to be the Son of God. All their movements came to an end. And yet the Jesus movement that was thought to have been ended when he's crucified under the reign of Tiberius, it's the best established fact of the ancient world. I mean, you truly have to check your brain at the door if you don't believe that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. It is truly the best established fact from antiquity, not just because our Bible says so, but because history says so. And when Jesus dies, it's thought that his movement ends, and yet men and women begin to claim to have had experiences of seeing him alive after he was crucified. And that movement launches around the world, so much so that we know there are Christians in Pompeii before the eruption of Vesuvius, when you think about that. I mean, that's just remarkable. So in the first century, Christianity has gone all the way to Rome. And what we have in the Shroud of Turin is we have a burial garment that's recorded in all four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all make reference, and let me give it to you in Greek, to the sindon. That's the Greek for fine linen, or athonia, the linen cloth. And then even the sudarian. That's the only Greek words I'm going to use in the whole broadcast. But all four make reference to the fact that when the earliest Christians saw not the empty tomb, but the burial garments inside the empty tomb, it says they saw and they believed. So there was something dynamic about the burial garments that they saw left behind in the tomb that caused them to believe that Jesus' body wasn't stolen. He was alive after the dead. And what's remarkable is we have this 14-foot wide burial cloth by 3 feet 7 inches wide. By the length is 14 feet 14 inches, that covers both the front and the back of a crucified man. It's located in Turin, Italy. That's why it's called the Shroud of Turin. Now, it didn't get to Turin until the 16th century. But what's remarkable is there is an image on the cloth of the front and back of a terribly crucified man, and all of it corresponds with the first century world of Jesus. And so I'll just leave it with there, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Have we traced its movement from Israel to...
Yes, we have. In fact, it's fascinating because I mentioned this on an interview last week with Glenn Beck, and then I didn't finish it. We have the garment has been tested for pollen spores. So a criminologist by the name of Max Fry spent 5 years of his life tracing all of the pollen, the plant life, pollen spores on the shroud. Wow. And if it is indeed a medieval hoax, you would not expect there to be pollen from the land of Israel that only blooms in spring in the time of Passover when Jesus was crucified. Jesus is crucified again. We know for sure April 3rd, AD 33, which means the resurrection would have taken place April 5th, AD 33. If you want to go with the AD 30 date instead, that would be April 7 he dies, resurrected April 9, AD 30. What's remarkable is that 2/3 of the pollen spores found on the shroud come from Jerusalem, and they only bloom in the spring. Now, what I didn't mention on the interview last week is there's also pollen that it literally traces the breadcrumbs all the way from Jerusalem to Turin, Italy. We know there's pollen from Edessa, Constantinople, that's modern-day Istanbul, Athens, France, and then ultimately in Turin, Italy, which is remarkable when you think about that.
That is fascinating.
Wow. Yeah.
And I know some of the detractors out there, I believe we were talking about this a little bit prior to the show, but I think it was 85 or 86, there was carbon-14 testing done that basically at the time they declared that the shroud was a medieval hoax because that carbon-14 testing placed it around 1300. If you will, talk a little bit about that and just kind of address that testing specifically.
Absolutely. So in 1988, 3 different labs were given very small pieces of the shroud, about the size of our pinky, Gary and Summer. And they were given these 3 pieces of the edge. If I had my shroud replica with me and we were looking at it behind me, it would be up on the top left if you're looking at it. So the very edge of the shroud, which has survived 3 fires, they took 3 pinky-size samples, and they sent it to 3 different labs for carbon-14 dating. Interestingly enough, all 3 labs came back with the same dating. 1260 to 1390. So you were right, 13th century. But what they didn't share in that original data was that the sample that they used was compromised. And you say, Jeremiah, how do you know it was compromised? Well, in the mid-1500s, the shroud survives a fire in France. And the nuns not only patch the holes from the fire, they do an invisible weave that invisibly weaves cotton. You can't see it with the naked eye, but you can see it under the microscope. There's cotton fibers actually woven in to the flax linen fiber. Now, that just happened in the patchwork of the nuns, the sisters in France. And so, obviously, they tested a patched area of the shroud because the rest of the shroud, and we have samples from the other aspects of the shroud, there is no cotton, okay? It's all just fine linen, very thin, a 0.3 millimeter thin. And so we're talking about a bad sample that was tested, and that's the only sample they've ever tested. And what I love about your program, about freedom-loving people that watch it, I've pointed this out, the British Library, which I love the British Library, I've been there many times, the British Museum, they suppress the raw data. We didn't even know this until recently because they suppressed the raw data of the carbon-14 research for over 20 years. And it was a Frenchman who believes in the authenticity of the shroud who did the equivalent of a Freedom of Information Act to get access to the raw data from the British Library. Isn't that interesting?
That is interesting.
And it makes sense that if there was fire damage, it would most likely be on the edges, and that would, in my mind, that was where it would be. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's survived other fires. Carbon is smoke. And so we have 5 other dating systems that do date the shroud much older than the Middle Ages, which is fascinating. That's why this is really newsworthy and timely that we're having this conversation on your program tonight, because just recently, another institute, the Institute of Crystallography in Italy, used something called wide-angle X-ray scattering, Waxis imaging. They took 2 samples. One sample from the shroud, which doesn't have cotton in it, by the way. It's pure linen fiber. And one sample from another burial shroud from Masada, AD 70, when Titus is literally razing Jerusalem and Israel to the ground. So you have 2 different burial shrouds, Shroud of Turin, the shroud from Masada. And they test them with this wide-angle X-ray scattering. And they look specifically at how long have the fibers of the linen weave shroud, how long have these been degrading? How long have they been getting old? How long have they been decomposing? And they came back with a perfect match, meaning that the shroud has been decomposing, as it will. It's had degradation on it for 2,000 years. It's been getting old for 2,000 years. That's fascinating, and that's why it was so newsworthy that we do have, in fact, a shroud from the 1st century based on this Waxis dating from the Institute of Crystallography in Italy.
That's amazing. Talk a little bit about, and I'm going to pull up a image that I have here real fast. So here we have the Shroud of Turin. So basically we have the picture on the left is what it actually looks like to the naked eye, and on the right, that's actually a photograph of it. So talk to everybody a little bit about what we're seeing right there. And why it's so interesting.
This is what blew everyone's mind. Now, for the benefit of our audience, anyone 30 and younger watching us tonight, there was a time when our phones didn't take pictures. They just made phone calls. In 1898, Secondo Pia is getting ready for a huge festival around the Shroud of Turin, and he's an attorney. Photography is still very expensive, and he's not a photographer. He's a lawyer, but he likes photography, and he builds a scaffolding, and there was no electricity in the church where the Shroud of Turin was put on display, so he had to bring electricity via generators into the church to take a picture with this very long exposure. He takes the photograph of the shroud, which is the sepia kind of dirty sheet looking on the right, if you're watching this at home. I think it's on the right. It's the yellow one. And he takes a picture of it. He goes in the dark room, Gary and Summer. He develops the glass plates. This was before even film. And he's never more appropriate if three words been uttered than when he looked at the face of the crucified man. In the negative, it becomes positive, and he says, "Oh my God." when he sees the face of the crucified man. And so the man becomes positive in the negative. So you can actually see the image much more clearly in the negative. And this is what, and again, in 1898, poor Secondo Pia is called a fraudster. He's called a liar. Because people just didn't believe this, okay? Photography was so new. And so that kicked off really modern scientific study of the shroud the last 125 years or so. And now here we are 127 years later. Scientists still cannot explain how there's this amazing crucified man image in the shroud. Something we should mention, Summer and Gary, is that the image is only superficial on the shroud, whereas the blood is completely absorbed through the shroud. The image is only on a couple of the fibers of each thread. Okay, a thread can have 70 to 150 fibers. The image only appears on 2 or 3 of the threads. It's superficial. It's razor thin.
As I have understood it.
I'm sorry?
I said it's like microns thick.
Yeah. Exactly. This is where if you get too far away from it, the image vanishes, and this is where having it with this wonderful image you have helps us so much. And so the questions are: A, if 5 of the 6 dating references are correct, and we do have a 1st century burial shroud, who is the crucified man? And so that's when my expertise comes into play. My expertise is the historical Jesus, Roman crucifixion. We know a lot of crucifixion victims in antiquity. How many of them were crucified in the way that's reflected with the crucified man? This is a great image that I love because this is a representation of how much energy would have required the image to be left on the Shroud of Turin. And keep in mind, I'm just using image because modern language fails. There is no pigment, there is no dye, there is no stain, there is no paint on the linen shroud, okay? And so when I say image, I'm saying that just so we understand what I'm saying. But we know, again, based on another lab in Italy studying for 5 years, that 34,000 trillion watts of electromagnetic energy, which occurred at 1/40th of a billionth of a second, a flash, causes the image. And those of us who believe in the authenticity of the shroud believe that is the moment of resurrection. Jesus' body flashes alive in the physical bodily resurrection.
Wow.
Now, and there's a couple things I think are worth bringing up too. Is number one, you didn't go into this believing that the shroud was legitimate. You thought it was a hoax prior to getting in there and studying on it. And the other thing I think is really interesting is they're finding that the shroud isn't just, it looks as if it's captured some movement by the ankles and some other things where it's basically caught a blurred or multiple images as portions of the person underneath this is actually moving. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. We can't explain how the image is in there. We can make approximations, but we truly cannot explain it. And you're right. I did not have the evidence for the resurrection is so powerful. We don't need the Shroud of Turin to believe in the resurrection more. We have incredible evidence for the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus. I have over 50 lines of evidence that I've written about in Body of Proof, both in the book and Bible study that I've written. But the shroud is fascinating because outside of the Bible, it's the only actual historical evidence that we have for the physical bodily resurrection that we can touch, which is really interesting to think about. It's fascinating to think about that. I was completely skeptical of it, not because I had studied it actually for myself and concluded that it was a hoax. I had read some headlines. I had seen some thinkers that I respected say, oh, that's just a hoax. And they were completely wrong, Gary. And now, having read the evidence for myself, I learned from everyone, but I never let anyone think for me. And having thought through the evidence carefully and then applied the specialty that I have with Roman crucifixion, I've concluded this is a slam dunk. We have the actual burial shroud of Jesus.
That's fascinating. And now that they've been able to do much more in-depth scan, there's actually a lot more information that they're actually seeing within the shroud itself, correct?
That's exactly right. Such as, again, let me make something clear. In 1978, 33 scientists go to Italy. They have 5 days to study the shroud, about around 120 hours. And these scientists are not theologians, they're not pastors, and they're men and women who said, like John Jackson from the Air Force Academy, a chemistry professor, who says, give me 15 minutes in the scientific method, and he jokes over drinks, I'll show you that the shroud is a farce, it's a fake, it's a hoax. They weren't saying that 15 minutes later after applying the scientific method. And these 33 scientists who did not believe it was authentic but couldn't explain it at the same time published their findings in the early 80s. And that's where they say this isn't a hoax. This is certainly not a forgery. This is something we can't explain. We have an image. It's consistent with everything we know about Jesus of Nazareth and the way in which that he was crucified. But we just, as scientists, we cannot explain it. Now, let me be clear. These are scientists from not just the Air Force Academy, but Sandia Labs, Los Alamos Labs. These are guys that were working on the A-bomb, Gary and Summer. They're from weapons labs. They're from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. These are scientists that cannot explain how the image is in the shroud. And I find that very compelling. It's one of the 5 reasons that I believe the shroud is authentic. The greatest scientific minds cannot explain how the image is there, and they certainly don't believe it's a hoax, and they've gone on the record saying that. And media just kept asking me over and over again about the shroud. And I thought, well, I need to be more prepared to answer that. Mm-hmm. And early on in some of the interviews that I did, I didn't really know how to answer, and I was skeptical, so I blow it off. And there are videos out there where I really blow off the shroud. Well, then my son became interested. One of my sons, my oldest son, he's like, Dad, can we look at that together? And, all I care about, if I can't pass faith on to my kids, I'm going to go work somewhere, not be in ministry and just work somewhere else in a secular job, because all I care about is my kids walking with Jesus. So I'll do anything, go anywhere in the world where my kids are interested. Just took my daughter to Greece to study in the footsteps of Paul. I'll go anywhere to pass on faith to my kids. And my son Justin was like, Dad, can we look at that together? Well, he thought it was interesting, and getting more than 2 sentences out of a teenage boy who's a gamer today is like a miracle. And so I was starting to get paragraphs out of him of dialogue, and so I wanted to keep this going. So whether the shroud was authentic or not, I was going down this path with my son. And as we began to study it together, he connected with it spiritually. And here's a key, and why I think this is interesting for your channel, where I know you don't normally have these kinds of conversations, but you have conversations with thinkers and Christian thinkers.
Yes.
We all want to find ways to connect with the next generation. And I am seeing that for Gen Z and Gen Alpha, anyone 30 years and younger, there is a fascination with this content. I mean, I have videos, reels on Instagram that have 5 million, 2 million views, and primarily it's young people engaging with this content because they see it as a tangible witness to religious Christian things. And so that's what caused me, Summer, to go down this journey, was just wanting to connect with my son. But so I kind of had the dad eyes on it at first, and then I started putting my scholar eyes on it and thinking, wow, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it might be a duck.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, regardless of whether you are religious or not, I mean, what you have to do is you have to take a look at this. And if it is a hoax, it's one of the most amazing hoaxes ever made, because we can't recreate this.
No.
And what also is pretty amazing to me is the fact that we have, I know it's a really bad picture of this, but basically within the scan, they can actually see that there are coins on the eyes of the person,
right,
on the eyes of Jesus, and they've got it to where they can get to the fidelity where they've now identified, I think, at least one of those coins. Is that correct?
Yeah, they think they're leptons or lepta, which are Roman coins. And to be clear, you can only see the coins on one image, the image from the 1930s that Henri took. And so, as we go down the rabbit hole, we have a couple of really great images of the shroud. And this is a contested thing, okay? Just so you know, this isn't like a slam dunk, but it is compelling because in the 1930s Henri photographs, we see very clearly what looks to be these leptons that are on the eyes of the crucified man, which would be consistent with Jewish burial traditions and Roman burial traditions. You know, as I said on the Glenn Beck program, I think I said, I can't remember which interview I've done now, we have Jews that are buried with crucifixion nails because they were thought to be good luck charms, like a rabbit's foot, if you would. And so we have that similar consistency here with the Henri photos from, I think, early 1930s. And the way that he captured the photo, it seems to be, we could see these leptons on the eyes. But that is contested by some. Now, I have yet to see compelling evidence against it, other than they can't see it in every photo. Okay.
Sure. Now, one of the other pieces of I think to me is one of the most compelling in I don't know. It's just one of the best pieces of evidence, because there's not just the Shroud of Turin. We also have the head cloth that Jesus had that was completely separate and was, as far as I know, is still in a separate location than where the Shroud of Turin is. And then they've actually since overlaid those, and they match.
Correct. Absolutely. In fact, I have images of it overlaid. So you're specifically referring to the Studiorum of Oviedo. Okay, Studarium is one of the words I used earlier in the broadcast. That just simply means face cloth in Greek. And here's what happens. Jesus is dead. And in Jewish burial traditions, before you bury him, Jesus is bleeding everywhere, and blood is thought to be part of the soul, part of the body. You don't want to even lose his blood on the ground. You want to bury him blood and all. The Jews did not embalm their dead. They had their own burial tradition where you would bury the person the day of their death, or if they died at night, the very next day. You would mourn the dead for 7 days. This is why you would heavily spice the body, because the body after around day 4 begins to stink, like in the case of Lazarus. And you would spice the body heavily because you would mourn the dead for 7 days. And then a year later, your oldest son would come to that tomb, collect your bones, and then put them in what's called ossulegium, second burial, a second burial service on the anniversary of death. And that's, if you've been to the land of Israel and you see all the bone boxes everywhere, those are, and they're about as long as your femur, the longest bone of your body, right? And so families would be buried together. So you have bone boxes where, the whole Johnston family, the family buried together stays together, as it were. And that's how it was in Jewish burial traditions. And so when Jesus is dead and he's hanging on the cross, this is fascinating. His head is like this, he's dead, and there's blood coming out. Well, they take this face cloth and throw it over his face, and including his back where his ponytail is. He has like a ponytail. His hair is together at the back with blood all over it. And they wrap his face and keep his face covered first, just to, he was naked. So we want to at least cover his face. And, who knows what his eyes were doing. And so they cover his face until they can get his body, they being Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, in the larger linen shroud, at which time they remove the face covering and they cover the whole body with this beautiful shroud from Joseph of Arimathea. They cast that in the corner, the face cloth in the corner, and that's what John 20 records. And then they leave the body there thinking, we have to do this because Passover is upon us. It's a high holy weekend. It's not only Passover, but it's the Sabbath, it's Shabbat. We'll come back Sunday morning and finish spicing the body. They come back Sunday morning, the body's gone. The Sudarian is in the corner where they left it. And there it is, right there, the Sudarian. And that's all blood. Now, here's a fascinating thing I want to share for your viewers. They've tested the blood on the shroud. They've tested the blood on the Sudarian. They're both human blood, and they're the exact same blood type, type AB blood. Fascinating.
And then they've actually scanned those as well, and the marks on the head shroud, as well as Shroud of Turin, the blood marks on those actually match perfectly, from what I understand. Is that correct?
Absolutely, they are. And yes, there is. In fact, I'm looking right now on my iPad. I'm going to try to hold this up and see if you can see. Do you see what I'm showing here? This is a rendition of, I'm going to hold it as close as I can to the camera. Yep. That's the face cloth with the face positioned over it, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And this is what I do for the benefit of my audience is, See that I'm going to see that how I put the face on there? That's the cloth that you were just showing, and then the face comes right over it. And that's where it was thought to be positioned with the shroud image. And the Studarium is right here. It's in Spain. This is a box that it's held in. I don't know if you can see this. That's a box. That's a facsimile behind it, okay? But that is the box where it's actually at in modern-day Spain, Oviedo. So you've got the face cloth, which all that is Sudarian in Greek, of Oviedo. It's in Spain, and that is very fascinating. It's just fascinating to me. We have the blood type, too, that matches.
Why is the face cloth in Spain while the shroud is in Italy?
You know, that I'm not aware of. I'm not as aware of the provenance, as we call it, of the face cloth. I've just honestly not had time to study why it's there. So I'm going to just tell you that's something I'm still working on.
Yeah, as far as I understand, those are almost like two separate holy relics that were, being kept by different people over time. And then come to find out, one was saying, oh, we have the burial cloth of Jesus, the shroud, and then we actually had the head shroud of Jesus. And then I think it was just in recent times that they've done any testing to compare the two, as far as I understand.
That's exactly right.
That's nuts. Usually I wait a little longer for some questions, but there are some questions that are relevant to our discussion. I'll throw this up real quick. AMX said, did they do DNA testing on it with recent technology?
Yeah, great question. I get this question all the time. We don't have enough information to DNA test the blood because too much DNA is on it. People have touched it forever. And so while we know that it's male blood, it's human blood, it's type AB blood, that's as far as we can go. We can't go any further than that because everybody's DNA is on it. I mean, I was horrified recently to see some of the worse work that's been done on the shroud, and people are leaning over it, breathing on it. They're not covered. So, people, this has been used as a tablecloth. It was used at infant baptisms throughout the years. And so, we can't go beyond that. And I have studied that at length, and we really don't know. But we do know it's an XY chromosome, so the person is fully human. And that's what we would expect, because theologically speaking, Jesus, yes, is fully God, but he's also fully human, born of a woman. And so he has those chromosomes in the blood type AB blood. What's interesting, too, a little note about the blood from the spear wound in the side is reflected on the shroud. There's a whole bunch of blood on the side, and when they tested that blood is postmortem blood, meaning they know that blood pooled after the crucified man was dead, which is different than the rest of the blood. And so as I've been telling people, if this is a modern hoax, if this is an elaborate forgery, you would have to kill someone and then take their post-mortem blood and splash that on along with the alive blood, as it were.
Right.
It becomes so fanciful. Why on earth would you think it was a hoax?
And it's important to note, too, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but as I understand it, it's AB negative. Is that correct? The blood type?
I've only ever read a type AB blood. I've not read the AB negative in any of the hematological reports.
Well, you would probably know better than me. I had heard that, but either way, AB is pretty rare blood type to begin with. And we have a head shroud in one place, and then we have, the Shroud of Turin in another. And for those to have the same blood type at all,
right,
in of itself is pretty crazy.
And they knew nothing about blood type, right? And 700 years ago. So let's just stay down. If this is a hoax, it becomes so elaborate. This is why a British man has said he'll give £1 million to anyone who can replicate what we have in the shroud.
Yeah. It's
because they weren't even aware of blood types then to know.
Exactly. That's just like they wouldn't be aware of the pollen spores that we have, just like they wouldn't be aware of the other uniquenesses of the shroud. And we do have the shroud from antiquity as well, reflected much older in antiquity. There's an image of the shroud in the Hungarian Prey Codex, which is 100 years before the carbon dating. We know the shroud is in Constantinople. We know Eusebius writes about the shroud, in the 4th century. So the shroud is much older even from antiquity that we know from the coinage, numismatics, from also the writings of different historians like Eusebius and others. So there's a fascinating history of it that antedates, if you will, that predates the alleged medieval date.
Richard Stryker said, would that type of linen have to be preserved in any way to survive over 2,000 years?
Great question, Richard. I think it was Richard. Sorry, I'm reading backwards. No. Linen is extremely stable. In fact, I got a message the other day from a Baylor graduate who watched one of my recent videos where I talk about the Tarkan dress, which is 3rd century BC, 3,000 BC, excuse me. So it's 5,000 years old. It's this beautiful linen top. It's a linen blouse. It's a linen shirt that is 3,000 years older than the Shroud of Turin. So given the right circumstances, linen is very stable. What's fascinating, though, to me is that the Shroud of Turin is a herringbone weave, which would have been very expensive and something that Joseph of Arimathea would have bought for himself or maybe his wife in their pre-death planning. We know that he has an elaborate tomb on the main intersection in and out of the old city of Jerusalem. So he's got his burial plot. He's going to be remembered. People are going to walk by Joseph of Arimathea's burial for generations to come as they go in and out of Jerusalem. They're never going to forget him. And oh, by the way, he's buried with the finest linen that you can have. He purchased it for himself. And yet he has that available and he gives it to Jesus.
There's another great question there, too, from Gary Shaver that I'm interested to hear the answer to. Has any other burial shroud been found with an image similar to this?
No. Great question, Gary. We have all kinds of Jewish burial shrouds. In fact, just recently, a tomb was found. This was fascinating. This is, all these minimalists who don't believe Jesus ever lived and he never did any miracles. When the lepers come, I think it's Luke 17, check me on that, when the lepers want to be healed by Jesus, you had all these people that said, oh, leprosy was not around in the time of Jesus. There is no Hansen's disease. We actually have the tomb of the shroud, look this up, that was discovered recently. And the gases and such were such that the body had not decomposed. 2,000-year-old DNA on this body from the 1st century, and lo and behold, it has Hansen's disease all over it. So this is a dead leper from the 1st century, buried with a burial shroud that, by the way, was dated with the same Oxford lab to the 1st century that claims that the Shroud of Turin is from the medieval era. Isn't that fascinating to think about? And so we have a burial shroud, Hansen's disease proved. So people did have leprosy, so Jesus actually healed real lepers in the 1st century. What do you know? The Gospels get it right. And then, but no image. We have no other burial shroud with an image on it.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Drones Under 2A says, you would think he would look more disfigured as the Bible described in Isaiah 52:14, still looks like a man.
Correct. This is very important. This is a technicality, but I want you to think about this. The image is from at what point? The image is not taken when Jesus is in rigor mortis. We know the wounds are there. We know the blood is there because he's wrapped and his body is in rigor mortis, which lasts up to 40 hours. Jesus is in, and that's a beautiful image. Thank you. It's like, why are his knees up? Why is his head? Because his body is stiff. And his buttocks is super stiff. Okay, you talk about buns of steel on the crucified man of the shroud. It's because wherever he was most abused, where these lashes, where the blood pools, that's where that rigor mortis is going to get very stiff. And so it wouldn't have looked like your finger pressing into a window. His body wouldn't have looked like that because it was so hard from the rigor mortis, and especially the bloodshed that he had experienced through both the flagrum, the scourging, and the death on the crucifixion. And okay, let me see. Oh, what was the question? Can you guys remind me of the question that Gary or that who?
Why did it look more disfigured?
You think he'd look more disfigured.
Right. Thank you. So forgive that senior moment. So again, the body is wrapped. There's all these wounds, but the image is from the moment of resurrection. So I don't believe that, yes, Jesus still had his wounds. He had the nail pierce. Remember when he comes to Thomas and Thomas says, unless I see his spear wound in his side, unless I see the nails in his hands, which again, that's the same Greek word as wrist, I won't believe. So Jesus in his resurrection still has those wounds. My wife and I were talking about this. I believe someday when we see Jesus face to face, he will still have those wounds. They're like battle scars that he's proud of. And so, yes, we could recognize Jesus in the resurrection. And so I believe that Isaiah prophecy rightly speaks to what Jesus looks like before he dies. I mean, it's a bloody mess. Yeah, you wouldn't recognize anyone. But I don't believe that is referring to how Jesus looks in the resurrection, because everybody recognized him. And the shroud image, I believe, captures that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
No, it does.
Perfect sense.
Makes perfect sense. God Offspring says, where was the highest concentration of blood found on the shroud?
Definitely the side wound, the spear wound, without a doubt. It just pops right off. You can see it with the naked eye. But then there's a huge concentration of blood behind the head from being bludgeoned. There are 30 to 50 puncture marks where the helmet, the dome of thorns, would have been put on his head. This was no mere thorn sweatband, like some kind of wreath. No, he was crucified completely naked, but he wasn't totally naked because they put a helmet of thorns and they crammed it on his head. And so we have 30 to 50, depending on how you count it, puncture marks. Every aspect of the body has wounds on it. So there's blood all over it, to answer this question. But the highest concentration behind the head, on the forearms, and then, of course, in the side wounds. I should also mention something I forgot to mention on Glenn's show recently. We actually have soil, travertine limestone soil, in the feet and in the knees. Where the knees are reflected and where the feet are reflected, there's travertine soil, which comes from Jerusalem. And so when Jesus falls, by the way, beautiful depiction of the crown of thorns there. I love that. That's that crown of thorns that, again, we see that very consistently, and we know of only one crucifixion victim who is crucified that way from late antiquity, and that is Jesus of Nazareth. But we also know that he falls on the way to the cross. The biblical record says that Simon of Cyrene is asked to carry the patibulum, the crossbeam. Jesus falls on the ground hard, and he probably skinned his knees that were probably already bloodied from the whipping, and that soil residue, that travertine limestone, is right there in the knees, in the shroud. So is the same with the feet. Isn't that cool?
Wow, that is cool.
That is crazy. And it also, one of the things that I don't think, one of the more complex portions of this, as far as when it comes to, if you were going to, try to create a hoax out of this, is there was a certain way that, the Romans actually crucified, putting the nails through the hands and ultimately through the wrists. And that is also reflected accurately on the shroud. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. In Christian tradition, and certainly in medieval tradition, the holes are always like right here in the middle of the palms. Well, this could not hold up 170 to 180 pounds. It's just not going to happen. It's going to rip right through the hands. But if it goes through the wrist, that's a whole different story. It goes right through the bones, and that will hold up the body that's 170 to 180 pounds. Again, medieval Christianity gets it wrong. The shroud, which is 1,300 years older than that, from the first century, gets it right. And again, the same word is used in the Greek New Testament for the hand and the wrist. The nail piercings are in the wrist of the crucified man, which is consistent with how men were crucified under the Roman Empire. And we see that reflected, that big white speck right there, or the black one if you're looking at the other one. That's all the blood from the wrist. So we know 3 nails are used, 2 in the 2 wrists, but we know the feet are nailed together with 1 nail. And so Jesus is gasping for every breath. It's hard to imagine that he even had the ability to speak because his lungs are filling with blood. He can't hardly breathe, and yet he is able to utter certain things from the cross. What is he uttering? Psalm 22. He's literally reminding himself of the Psalms, the Messianic Psalms, as he's dying in our place.
Yeah.
Fascinating. A.M. Atkinson says, why not retest carbon dating with another section of the shroud if that is believed incorrect?
Because the Catholic Church is totally custodial of it now, and they have not allowed any other testing of it except the testing that took place in 1978. I wish they would do more, is the short answer.
Now, do you believe that that original test was done in good faith and they just happened to grab it?
I do.
Okay.
I do. I don't believe. The only thing that causes me to question it a little bit is that the same lab that called it a medieval forgery also tested the tomb of the Shroud and called it first century. So that's interesting to me. And I also don't like that they suppressed the raw data, they being the British Museum. And so, I know scientists, and I want to think that it was done in good faith, and that's my initial inclination to think well of people. But why suppress the data for 20 years? Why does it take like a freedom of, why not just put out the raw data? Why don't you let us know your sample was compromised, that your sample did indeed have cotton in it where the rest of the shroud doesn't? Why not make that the global headline? And so, I think the Catholic Church took a huge hit with that, with the Shroud did indeed, that, oh, this is a fake, this is a forgery 10 years after the STURP team, the Shroud of Turin research team. And so there's a part of me that understands them not really trusting scientists to touch it again in some respects when you think about it. So I do think it was done in good faith. I hope it was. Am I certain of that? No.
It does seem like instead of taking one section, it seems like and again, they were doing this with the permission of the Catholic Church. We don't know what they were allowed to do, but it would seem like it would make sense if they would test multiple sections.
Absolutely.
But again, that could have been completely controlled by the church. Who knows?
We do know that there are parts of the shroud from the center that certain labs have and certain scholars have. So we do know they're out there if they could be tested. But again, when you test it for carbon-14, you damage it forever. It's gone. So it's hard if they want to do that. Especially, again, I call this a controlled revelation. We have all these other sciences, like the Waxus ones. Like, okay, carbon-14 comes out. Okay, it's first century. But we know of at least 4 other academic disciplines that have dated it to the first century. Everything about it, the word I use, it exhibits verisimilitude with the first century world of Jesus. All the medieval art shows this very effeminate Jesus. No beard, super weak. That's not the Jesus we see reflected in the Shroud of Turin. This is a masculine, strong man, 170, 180 pounds, 5 feet 10, 5 feet 11, a strong man, a man of strength. Doesn't mean he's Superman, but just a strong man, not a weak, fledgling, weenie Jesus with no beard that's reflected in a lot of medieval art.
Michael Butler says, is the fabric made from only one type of fabric minus the repaired area? The Hebrews wear clothing made of 2 types of fabric, like linen and wool woven together.
Correct. It's fine linen, pure linen made from flax. It's all linen straight through, and it's very thin. It's 0.3 millimeters thickness. So.
07 Black Dog, this is a great question, and I agree with this. It says, I don't need the shroud to believe the Lord's resurrection, but why do you think that the Lord would do this, seeing that he hid Moses' body? People tend to worship these things.
Right. Absolutely they do. But I also think that, we know more about our faith than the great Christian thinkers who lived generations before us. There was no such thing as biblical archaeology 200 years ago. When you look at the history of biblical archaeology with the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA and MI6, biblical archaeology is rife with espionage and murder and conspiracy. It's a fascinating thing I have a whole talk I give on biblical archaeology and how it began. It really is a relatively young science. And so thanks, though, to biblical archaeology, I can be more precise in my interpretation of Scripture. And again, if these things really happen, there should be fallout all over the ancient world, and there is. Right. And so while we don't need the shroud, I agree with this person. I've published 250,000 words on the resurrection of Jesus and mentioned the shroud 0 times, okay? The case is so airtight for the resurrection of Jesus. And there are many of you out there, you read it in your Bibles, you heard it at Sunday school, and you believe it, and that settles it. I praise God for you. But it doesn't mean that the material culture isn't going to reveal truth. All truth is God's truth. We know that the Jesus movement appears in the material culture all over the Mediterranean world from the 1st and 2nd century. I mean, we have the Jesus Cup that's discovered in 2008 in Alexandria by a marine diver, Frank Baggio. And on the cup is incised as Hogo Estes Die Christu, through Christ the magician. Jesus' name is so famous that in his lifetime, people are casting out demons and calling down spells through this name Jesus, because the name is known to have power. And that's consistent with what we see in the Gospels. Remember, the disciples come to Jesus and say, hey, these people we don't know, these strangers, they're like using your name to cast out demons. And he said, let them alone. You know, those that are for us are for us. Those that are against us are against us. A house divided against itself cannot stand. And so do we have to have the shroud for it? No. But am I surprised? Are people worshiping it? No one that I know is worshiping the shroud. They're taking it as yet, they don't pray to it. They don't think they're a better Christian the closer they get to it. But it's another interesting layer of evidence. And this is why I'm a Christian, not just because the scriptures give us the biblical story, but I see the entire Roman world and how it was impacted, and indeed how Christianity has been impacting the world for the last 2,000 years. Newsflash, Christians were the greatest force for good on planet Earth.
Yeah, and while you shouldn't need much more than the Bible as evidence, at the same time, we shouldn't reject and just
correct
evidence that's there. I mean, I think that also talks to a lot of people. And I think whether you talk about some of the archaeological evidence that backs up everything, a lot of things in the Bible, I think that is a way to minister to people, to reach people that may need that extra push. And I think, again, it's one of those things that people should talk more about, that the Bible in many different instances has been proven correct time and time again. And I think most people just dismiss that, or even Christians don't look for those things. And I think I don't think that's the right approach either.
No, and because it helps us, it reveals more about our faith. We look at it through historical eyes. This is why we make pilgrimages to the land of Israel. It's why we go to the Holy Lands. We want to walk where Jesus walked. We want to have those same experiences, because the Bible is not like the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus. The Bible is about real people, real places, real events. And since those events really happen, we can go study those events, and we can historicize those events and then apply those timeless principles to our lives. That's what I just did with my daughter, Lily. We went all over the world of Paul and Turkey and the Aegean Islands and Greece, and we studied, and I put myself in Paul's place on the Areopagus in Acts 17, saying, I proclaim to you this God you don't worship, I proclaim to you is Jesus, who died and is crucified and resurrected. It was powerful for me to stand there and experience that and think that Paul one day stood here and said those very words as reflected in Acts 17. And so we shouldn't discount it either. And I want to caution any believer who's like, oh, I don't need any of that. This is a waste of time. Really? Thomas needed it. Are you better than Thomas? Are we better than these early Christians that, hey, they needed some proofs? And when Luke opens up his magisterial work, Acts, and he uses the same word autopsy, he said, we were autoptes. We literally were eyewitnesses of these things, and now we proclaim those things which we've seen. I want to have that same experience.
Mm-hmm.
Even doubting Thomas needed to see some holes in the
That's right.
Jesus. And as Jesus is standing there in front of him.
And Jesus does not shame him for that. Jesus does not shame John the Baptist in Luke 7 when he says, hey, are you really the one? I know I baptized you and I said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, but I'm having my doubts because I'm getting ready to have my head chopped off. I'm in the prison of Machaerus, and Herod and Antipas is getting ready to cut off my head. Are you really the guy? And what does Jesus say in Luke 7? Go back and tell John. And he gives him evidence. He says, don't feel this way or don't vibe me. He says, the blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, and the dead, and he is the Greek, are necrosagyro, the dead stand up alive. That's me.
I think this is a misunderstanding of something that you said earlier. Derek Tyler, I know it is. He didn't hear completely, but Derek Tyler said regarding Hansen's disease, it would be unscriptural if the sacrifice wasn't free of disease. Is it possible that one of Jesus's handlers or someone in the Middle Ages transferred evidence of the shroud? You were referencing a different shroud.
Right. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. No, there is no Hansen's disease on the Shroud of Turin. I was making the comparison that we have other shrouds, other burial shrouds from the land of Israel in the time of Jesus, and that the same lab dated that shroud, the tomb of the shroud, to the 1st century, that tried to say the Shroud of Turin was medieval. And I was just throwing in a footnote that, by the way, that had Hansen's disease on it, which is yet another evidential proof that the Gospels get it right. Sorry for any confusion.
No. It's okay.
Peter Terrazas saying the imprint is a result of the intense quickening light regenerating his return from death to life again eternal. So, and that is essentially the conclusion, that the moment that Jesus, and I'm asking you to correct me if I'm wrong, but the moment that Jesus, was resurrected was essentially what is believed. Again, there was some sort of intense light, there was some sort of process that created some sort of imprint on the shroud that can't be, as far as I understand it, cannot be reproduced, and we don't really know how that took place.
We can't replicate it. We're trying. We can get up to that level of energy, but it has to happen a lot longer than 1/40th of a billionth of a second, and then it just absolutely tears the sample to shreds. It just completely dies. The sample doesn't make it. And so we can't reproduce it. Yes, it is the moment of resurrection. So you think about, what are the implications here? We see similarities. Mark chapter 9, Jesus is transfigured, and the disciples want to stay there. We know Revelation says that someday there will be no need of the physical sun in the new heaven and the new earth, the resurrected heaven and new earth, because Jesus will give everything light. Literally, light will emanate from him, so we won't even need the sun then. And we see that reflected at the moment of resurrection in Jesus. And so we have to ask ourselves then, if this really is authentic, and if it is Jesus' resurrection, what are the implications? And so that's what we might leave people with. Well, it validates everything Jesus said. He died, he rose again, so everything Jesus taught about is true. He's coming back to judge the living and the dead. He's the King of Kings, he's the Lord of Lords, so it validates every bit of his teaching. It also tells me that this is God's answer to the suffering and injustice in our world. So many of us, the question that never goes away, why did this happen? Where was God when this happened? The resurrection seems to be God's answer. And then finally, it gives me hope. I don't live just for this world, the 80 or so years I may have on this earth. I'm living for the next life, the life that lasts forever, and there's good evidence that that's going to be a physically resurrected life. We're going to know each other then, but our bodies are going to be different, and they're going to be like Jesus' body, and that is a message that will get traction today.
Folks, I see some comments over in the said comment section that are getting into doctrinal and or denominational points of contention. That's not what this is about. We're not gonna delve off into that. I don't see anything productive taking place here. Go talk to your pastor and bring those debates to somebody else. I don't think this is the place or the forum for that. We're talking about the historic and scientific evidence behind the shroud, and I think that's where we need to keep it right there. Let's see. Otter did ask, and Otter, I'm so glad. So we've been streaming on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook for a really long time. And it wasn't just till recently that, I don't know, I guess Rumble did some sort of plug-in to where we could actually see the comments on Rumble on this platform, on this StreamYard platform. So Otter's always over on Rumble, and it's just nice to be able to see him over there. So Otter says, what did they use to wash his body? Was it just water?
We don't know. I can only speculate. We honestly don't know. And this is where I'm never going to go further than the evidence. We know his body was prepared in haste. We don't know that it was necessarily washed, because I truly believe they thought they were going to return Sunday morning with spices. By the way, there's no evidence of any spices on the shroud. I should mention that. I get that question all the time. What about the 100 Roman pounds, 75 U.S. pounds of spices? Well, the shroud has no evidence of any spice on it. So maybe they're coming back Sunday morning to spice the body. Maybe they didn't get around to it in time on Friday before nightfall when the body had to be buried. These guys did not have much time. So we just don't know how the body was washed. We just know the body was prepared. I think it was prepared in haste. I think it was kind of a part done job. And I think they were returning to do the rest on Sunday morning.
Interesting. What are some other elements of the shroud? Khan's asking, was it treated with olive oil? I know we've talked about the frankincense and myrrh that I don't think actually you said there wasn't evidence of.
Correct.
What are some other elements of the shroud that most people probably don't know about?
Just the brutality of crucifixion. We know that there's 700 scourge marks. There's 372 wounds, but we don't have the lateral sides. We only have the front and back. And so we know all of the front and back, the body is just covered with wounds. There's not a part of the body that's not wounded. So Jesus was whipped on the front and on the back in the nude, but we don't have the sides. We don't have the lateral sides on the shroud as far as the image goes. So we can estimate somewhere around over 700 wounds. 120 lashes. Jewish law had a law that you could only lash someone 40 times. Roman execution had no such law. And so we think two guys probably wailed in about 60 lashes each. They were probably very fatigued. They probably gave Jesus everything they could. We know one was taller than the other. They whipped and scourged him in a very close proximity, so there was a demonic intimacy to the abuse that Jesus. Don't think that this is a whip like with the length of Indiana Jones from the movies. They're kind of whipping him from the other end 25 yards away. No, this is a very intimate lashing. They're very close to him. The flagrum would have had not bone, but lead dumbbells, almost looked like lead dumbbells on it. Two balls on each side, would have torn into his skin. And so I think just the brutality of it is something that I'm continually studying. Just the overall brutality of it is still very sobering to me.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I guess I'm looking at right now. I'll end up pulling it up for everybody. But the flagrums used by the Romans, that is, and like you said, it's really short, actually.
Right. It's not nearly as long as you would think. So there was spitting going on. There was kicking. It was grotesque in many ways. Interesting.
So what are some of the other elements within the shroud? One of the questions I thought of earlier, I don't know if they actually have they done any carbon-14 testing on the headcloth?
Not that I know of. I haven't seen anything published on the dating of the headcloth using carbon-14.
That's it. And that is actually in Spain, you said, right?
Right. That's in Spain. You can go see the facsimile today. The real one is in the box. And by the way, I should mention the shroud is not on display in Turin right now. So if you fly over there, you're going to see the facsimile. I'm doing a tour. Our ministry, Christian Thinker Society, is acquired and in partnership with Athonia from Rome. And so we're doing a tour in certain cities across the country where I'm bringing the Shroud of Turin replica. This is a museum quality replica that's based on the photography done by documenting photographer Barry Schwartz, who was there studying the shroud in person in that 5-day period that I mentioned to you. So I have the exact authenticated shroud replica. We have 30 banners that are 4x8 that explain all of the science that go into the shroud. And then we actually have a bronze life-size crucified man statue, so you can get up front and see it. That's especially helpful for young people. We have all of the crucifixion elements, and so we're going from California all the way to the East Coast in certain cities. So I would encourage people to check out, again, our website and my email list, because it may be coming to a city near you. It's definitely worth making the trip to check out the exhibit.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. The other interesting thing, you asked me about another fascinating thing that I'll just mention briefly. Eric Jumper and two professors from the Air Force Academy, Eric Jumper and John Jackson, in 1976 utilized a machine called a VP8 image analyzer that was used for radar. It studied fault lines. It studied topography. and they put the picture of the Shroud of Turin, the crucified man, through the VP8 image analyzer. And the VP8 image analyzer result was that there is a 3D encoding in the Shroud of Turin that is unexplainable, meaning it's very similar to a topographical map. There's a 3D topography to the Shroud image, whereas you put any other 2D picture through the VP8 image analyzer and it's just flat 2D. And so it is there's 3D information embedded in the Shroud from this VP8 image analyzer. You can look at this on YouTube. It's fascinating. And that finding is what gave rise to the scientists who went over to study it, because they're like, hey, nothing else does this. What does this mean? There's 3D information within the Shroud. Isn't that fascinating?
That is.
That is. I'm actually going to pull up a picture of that in just a second as well. But so how were they able to put that image or the Shroud through that image analyzer?
You can see it on YouTube. So they actually had just an image, not the actual Shroud, just an image of the Shroud. Yeah, that was really the fascinating thing. Yeah, they wouldn't see the Shroud for 2 years after that, but that was the impetus that caused the Catholic Church to agree to the Shroud being analyzed.
Interesting.
Yeah, see that topography there? There's a 3D information. And again, they couldn't explain how that is. And it has to do with the light. We can go down a rabbit trail because, it's truly fascinating.
I have a quick question. Is there at any point where the actual Shroud is on display?
Well, it hasn't been on display since 2015. And a lot of damage was done to the Shroud when it was last on display. I don't think it's going to be on display anytime soon.
What caused the damage?
People seeing it just out. It's old. It's frail. And just literally, you can pull up. Hundreds of thousands of people lined up to see it. Hundreds of thousands. So, just all of that people mass coming around it. And you have people that do silly things, even though it's protected. There's also a fascinating YouTube video. The Shroud survived a fire in the late 90s. I just recently watched this YouTube video because it was supposedly in bulletproof, unbreakable glass, and a fireman runs into the cathedral in Turin, St. John the Baptist Cathedral, and he takes a fireman's axe. And it was like he had the adrenaline that some of us can get during an emergency or during a first responder situation. And he just starts whacking this unbreakable glass. He's able to break it. And then he's able to grab the Shroud and get it out of the fire. This is in the late 90s. And so you can check that out on YouTube. And so, the Shroud is continually, I think that was the third fire it had survived. And that just happened in 1997.
Well, that's pretty fascinating. This is actually a really good question, and I think important. Isn't the image only on one side of the fiber?
This is interesting. Yes and no. The image on the dorsal, so the back, is not on the back of the Shroud, but the image does go through on the front to the other side, which is interesting. So it's still superficial, but you can see the image on the other side of the front, not the dorsal, the back side, because that was against the limestone. But the image does go through on the front in some areas.
So it goes all the way through the...
Yeah, really interesting. It's not full absorption like the blood, but you can see the image because it's this belief. You can Google this. It's too much for this conversation, but this fall-through hypothesis that the body just, when it came to life, just went through the sheet, essentially.
Interesting. We're going to jump into something I guess I'm I'm pretty skeptical of, but opinion regarding, and you feel free to answer this if you want or not, but opinion regarding Ron Wyatt's claim that he found the Ark of the Covenant and took some dried blood from the mercy seat to a lab. When reconstituted and examined under a microscope, the cells were still alive.
So again, I want to be super respectful because there's fine Christians that have been very moved by Ron and his work. And so I say this with fear and trepidation, but I work with actual archaeologists who are licensed with the IAA, who tell me that Ron has no credibility. And so I would not put any weight behind his findings. I just spoke for Associates of Biblical Research. This is an incredible Christian organization that has work right now in places like Shiloh. They call it Shiloh in Israel, by the way, but they're in season 5 of their dig at Shiloh. They've dug they're a license with the IAA. I was asking the director of excavations about some of these claims because I want to look. These are all great questions, and again, they're just YouTube famous. There's no evidence behind it, and so I want to be careful saying that because there's a lot of fine Christians that have been really moved by his work, and I certainly respect that. But it's not respected out in the real world of archaeology, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and folks, as far as I know, somebody was just asking Dr. Johnston, his website and his
Thinkers.com.
ChristianThinkers.com. I thought that was actually in the description below. I just checked. That will be remedied right after we end this stream. We'll make sure we get that up there. So ChristianThinkers.com.
Throw up Joe's comment real quick.
Joe.
All the way at the bottom.
Joe, I came on late. Have you mentioned about the upcoming International Shroud Conference in July, August 2025? I didn't even know there was one.
Yes, thank you, Joe, for mentioning this. I'm delighted to say that I want to encourage people to Google the Shroud International Conference. This is happening in St. Louis, beginning, I think, July 30th or 31st through the first few days of August. And it's at a beautiful setting. The Augustine Institute will have the Shroud artifacts there. And then, world leaders who are knowledgeable about the Shroud will be speaking at this from all over the world. I'll be speaking at it. We'll have panelists there as well. So I would encourage you to sign up for that. If you can make it, if you're interested in attending, I'm going to be there, many others. This is kind of it's like a Shroud Con. I'm going to call it Shroud Con, like Sneaker Con. It's where you want to be if you're a Shroudie or interested in these kinds of questions. That's why I'm very happy to be part of it, and I'm honored they asked me to.
It's SHOT Show for the Shroud.
That's right. SHOT Show for the Shroud crowd. Is Shroudy a thing? Is that a
Yes, Shroudy is a thing. I've come to understand.
Well, that's pretty fascinating.
Yep.
Well, folks, first of all, Dr. Johnston, I can't thank you enough for coming on.
Yeah.
This has been super cool. It was
What an
great
honor.
talking.
I've loved it, Gary and Summer. I've loved every minute of it. Thank you so much for your questions. And also thank you for doing the book giveaway with my book, Body of Proof. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Our pleasure. That's the least we could do. But yeah, we'd love to have you on anytime you got some new stuff coming out or new information comes out. We'd love to have you on. And I know you do a lot of other research other than just the shrouds. So
Right.
We could fill up several more hours just talking about biblical archaeology. Folks out there, if you haven't ever been to the Biblical Museum, the Bible Museum,
Museum of the Bible.
Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. It is one of the most fascinating, objectively speaking, one of the best museums that you will ever go to. I'm assuming, Dr. Johnston, you've been there.
I've been there. I signed it in steel when it was being built. So I was one of the people that helped get it off the ground. So y'all, I'm going to say goodnight because I'm actually going to get to the book of Romans study that I go to. I'm under the teaching of God's word. So if you don't mind, I'm going to say goodnight and get over to Romans so I can join my wife. She's texting me saying she has a seat saved for me. But thank you guys for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you.
God bless you guys.
You as well. Thank you.
Take
All
care.
right, we're going to call it a night, but we thank you for tuning in. And as always, until next time, stay armed, stay ready.